SQIP. And so all that being said, I'm happy to now introduce you to the organizer of this virtual salon, the wonderful Dr. Sue Matulski, who's organized today's salon and this group of panelists here who all will be collectively addressing voice-centered relational methods and specifically using the listening guide for social justice research. And so without further ado, I'll give the floor over to you, Dr. Matulski.
Thank you, Nisha. I am delighted to be here. As Nisha said, I am Sue Matulski from Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I am thrilled to have with me two of our recent graduates from our doctoral program, a PhD in counseling psychology, transformative leadership, education and applied research, Brandon Jones and Kimberly Cherry, who will be presenting their dissertation research and their use of the listening guide in that research. I'm also very happy to have Dr. Renee Spencer of BU here. Renee worked very closely with Carol Gilligan and is one of the authors of the seminal 2003 chapter on using the listening guide. I will do kind of an overview of the listening guide method before Brandon and Kimberly give specific examples of it in their social justice oriented research. And partly I recognize that there are people on this call who have a lot of experience perhaps with using the listening guide, and also people who may be very new to it, doctoral students or others who are not familiar. So I really want to provide an overview. And I want to bring in a little bit of content and put in a plug for the very recent 2021 special issue of Qualitative Psychology Journal, which is edited by Carol Gilligan and provides numerous examples of all kinds of research from around the world that uses the listening guide. So I'm going to share my screen and get started with this. Great. Okay, so what are we talking about? What is the listening guide? And it is a relational, voice-centered, narrative, qualitative method. A radical listening that, quote, marks a path to discovery that holds potential for transformation. And therefore, it is excellent as a method that will be used for social justice and related research. It's also ideal for any kind of psychological research, and it encompasses constructivism and critical feminist epistemologies. So I would call it critical feminist constructivist as a label for this approach, because it seeks to both understand people's inner worlds as they navigate, experience, or live with conflict, their challenges, their relationships, and their social and material worlds, and also to, quote, disrupt prevailing cultural narratives and power structures. So it really does both a constructivist function of understanding meaning making and also a critical feminist look at the worlds in which people inhabit. So the little bit of history, this comes from the work of Carol Gilligan and her colleagues on girls' development and women's psychology from the 1980s. And it focused originally on silenced women's voices and girls' voices, and then really led to other unheard voices in the research. And so this method centers the participant's voice in the context of culture and relationship. Its origins stem from several sources, which I think is one thing that makes it very interesting. Freud, his ideas about associative logic and dissociative processes, Piaget's early work on clinical cases and questioning to understand people's worlds, close reading, point of view and voice from new literary criticism, and musical forms such as counterpoint and fugue. So there is a little bit of, oh dear, this is, I don't know how to get the little things in here. Look at this. Um, shows the different things of dissociation, literary criticism or voice, music, forms, all tied together by relational lenses, but within the context of culture and history. So the listening guide uses successive readings or listenings to interview transcripts or texts, listening for the interplay of multiple voices through varying interpretive frameworks, drawing on, quote, voice, resonance, and relationship as ports of entry into the human psyche. The psyche is conceived as being relational, dynamic, embodied, and in constant interaction with social, material, and cultural contexts. Another reason for this method was developed to kind of respond to traditional qualitative data analysis, which involved categorical methods like coding, taking snippets of information. And this is a more contextual analysis that provided a contrast to that more conventional approach. So what is my connection to this method? I was a doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, working with Carol Gillian and my advisor, Annie Rogers, who both worked on this method. And I was in the same cohort with my colleague, Renee Spencer, and also Lynn Sorceley, both of whom have used this method in research. And I myself used it in my dissertation on midlife women and career change. And I'm currently using it in my research on transgender adults and career decision-making. So there are 4 questions that really guide the listening, and these questions about voice, relationship, and cultural context provide an excellent overview. The first, who is speaking and to whom? Who is listening? The second, in what body? Which re-emphasizes the importance of embodied voice. 3, telling what stories about relationship. And 4, in what societal and cultural frameworks. There are a number of uses for the listening guide, but here are some of the ones that really provide an excellent opportunity to make use of its particular qualities. It's great for understanding a sense of self in marginalized or oppressed groups, those unheard voices. We think it's very appropriate for social justice issues that, quote, disrupt embedded power dynamics and social structures. It's also excellent for issues that are taboo, emotionally sensitive, or difficult to discuss. So it's been used in so many different examples, but a few that's been very, very helpful are sexual abuse disclosure, trauma, sexuality and sexual violence, postpartum depression, LGBTQ identities, Holocaust survivors, and many, many more. Also, people experiencing a process that is inherently conflictual or that leads to ambivalence or contradiction. So a couple of the key points about the listening guide and voice, things to remember. The first is that all of the research is a relational activity. This is not just for the analysis of the data. It's a relational activity from start to finish, and it requires curiosity, empathy, and openness to discovery. Attunement to associative logic is also critical because voicing the self reveals how we may know and not know what we know. These sequential listenings bring the researcher into relationship with a multivocal interplay of a person's psychological experience. It addresses researchers' concerns about ventriloquizing or speaking for someone else, voicing over other voices, or ignoring what can be known or said within the researcher relationship. It also requires the research to engage not only with participant voices, but with their own social location and responses to what is said and not said. So researcher response is embedded in the method. So now to the listenings. The first listening is listening for plot, as well as the researcher's response to the interview or the text. And it's guided by some of these questions. What is the psychological terrain? How is the voice embodied? What does the voice literally sound like, and how does it present? How do we as listeners respond emotionally and relationally to the participant? How do we listen to our own voice in the interview? And how do we listen not only to what is said, but what is unsaid or covered over? This step is similar to general qualitative approaches, but the focus here is really on the relational attunement of this method. The second listening is what's often called I poems. This is listening for the I, the first person voice, the voice of the self, to hear how people speak of themselves and come into relationship. So this is done by choosing salient chunks of text or interview transcripts and marking all the times that the first person pronoun I is used, followed by a verb and sometimes an object. This creates an I poem using associative, nonlinear logic that may reveal both the knowing and the not knowing, and allows the researcher to note patterns in the self-portrayal. These I poem examples are illuminating. They may be emotionally moving, and they really help the researcher lead to the discovery of dissociation. So I will give you a quick example, which is showing up here on the side of the screen. This is from Lori Kolsch's work on research from women's unwanted sexual experiences. You can read the I poem there. But what she says is that poetry is one way to access the associative logic of the psyche. It is not the same as the rational causal logic that dominates much of psychology. And you'll get more examples when Brandon and Kimberly talk about their research. The third listening is for contrapuntal voices. These are listenings that trace at least two, sometimes there are more, different voices present in the text or interview that are related to the research question. And then attention is given to the interplay of these voices. Are they in harmony or in opposition? Are they contradictory or overlapping? Is one predominant, or are they pretty well simultaneous? What is their relationship and how do they respond to the research question? One point that's made in the 2021 issue that is excellent is that the voices themselves are not the findings, which is an area of confusion, that the voices are tools to the interpretation, not the themes themselves. So just for people who may not know, let me give a couple of examples of contrapuntal voices that have been found in the literature. From the early work on girls' development, there is a voice of resistance or resilience in girls and a voice of distress or capitulation. In the disclosure of sexual abuse, there is a voice of disconnection or distress and a voice of connection and empowerment. In my own work on women in career transition, there was a voice of stagnation or stuckness and a voice of growth and transformation. In Johnstone's work on women's experiences of unacknowledged rape, she found 3 voices: a voice of knowing, one of not knowing, and one of ambivalence. And in the recent special edition, there was a fascinating study by Israeli women in military combat units where they noted a distinction between an I voice and a second person you voice. So there are lots of ways to do this. This is an example from Dusty Johnstone's listening guide analysis of women's experiences of unacknowledged rape. And you can see over on the right, the voices, the not knowing, the knowing, and the ambivalent voices. And this is an I poem, but it also expresses some of these voices, where her participant said, I don't think it turned out all that horribly. I don't know. I was just too naive and too drunk. I guess I feel as though it would. I don't know. Is what happened to me, is that rape? I wouldn't know. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. And often reading these out loud really conveys a different feeling of the story that's embedded within them. So once you've done all of these steps, there's a possible added step. Kegelman in 2021 suggests adding a step before the I poems, which she calls listening for social context. And she tracks markers of this social context in participants and researchers, and feels this is very applicable to research on social justice. This was very interesting to read about because I do think that the listening guide method attends to participant and researcher social context. It's embedded in the method itself, but because Kegelman is using this additional step in social justice research, she's emphasizing the importance of that issue. So it was interesting to consider if you're doing that kind of work. Basically, you then use iterative analysis to identify patterns found in the voices and in the narrative. And it's a good idea to look at what is surprising to you as the researcher. And then you compose the interpretation with supporting evidence. And these final steps of analysis and interpretation convey, quote, not only what we have come to know, but how we have come to know it. There are a lot of advantages and challenges to using the listening guide method. I'm not going to read all of these, but it has a lot of advantages in that it's creative, it's poetic, it's multi-layered. It does work very well for social justice research because it can challenge hegemonic assumptions and inform social justice aims, and it provides an avenue for unheard voices. But it also facilitates reflexivity, enhances validity because of all the different layers in there. However, it does require a lot of research skill and rigor. It's very labor and time intensive. There's a lot of self-reflection on the researcher's part that's required. And I do believe there is some ethical challenge in staying in relationship with the self and others. And it's not suited to all types of inquiry. So there are pros and cons to be considered. So in conclusion, the listening guide then enriches our understanding through the use of, quote, polyphonic voice-centered methods, sensitive not only to voice and silence, but also harmony and dissonance. And yet it also problematizes binary constructions, such as dichotomies between voice and silence, or powerful and powerless. And it illuminates the, quote, complex and multi-layered nature of human experience and the interplay between self and relationship psyche, and culture. So I do have some recommended readings, which hopefully will show up in the video if you are interested in looking at other material, including the 2021 special issue and also the 2015 qualitative psychology issue. And so I thank you very much. We will be taking questions at the end if you have other questions about how this method works. But right now, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Brandon Jones. Brandon.
Hi there. Thank you, Sue. I appreciate it. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Share. And hopefully y'all can see it now. I can't see your faces, so I'm going to trust that unless someone shouts, I'm good to go. Okay, great, wonderful. So welcome. We're here, or I am here to share a bit about my dissertation project with y'all. Think of it as an overview, a wedding of your appetite for how I wrestled with how to use the listening guide in my project. So it's entitled Counseling While Black, a critical inquiry exploring the experiences of Black master's level counselors in non-academic, predominantly white mental health settings. And so a bit about the why and the who behind this work. So this project stemmed initially from a formative assignment in my doctoral training. It was an assignment that was really designed to help us navigate or learn how to navigate using databases and other tools for research with the research librarian. And we just had to practice doing queries, really. And, they say to, write about what you know, so to speak. And so I was interested in seeing what was in the literature about the experiences of Black mental health counselors, master's level mental health counselors who were doing this work. And I couldn't find a bunch, at least not a bunch of qualitative research that focused on the experiences of the clinicians as the focus of the research. There was some work that focused on the therapist-client relationship in a number of ways, but nothing that focused on the clinicians themselves. And so for me, that was a problem. And I started my journey toward wrestling with what it means to be doing this work in a field that doesn't have the empirical literature reflecting the experiences of folks like me. And so that also highlights a bit of my epistemological stance, because I believe that part of our work is not only to take stock of how the world is constructed around us, but it's also to take stock of the ways in which power imbalances, how inequity shapes our experiences, and to do work to transform them. And so once I realized that there wasn't much that reflected the lived experiences of Black mental health clinicians in predominantly white settings, I knew that I had an opportunity to offer an important contribution to the field. So without a doubt, my identities, as a Black male, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, master's level clinician who has cut his teeth in predominantly white settings, necessarily informed how I approached this work and informed how I related to my participants as well. And so in front of you now, I've got the 3 questions that anchored my research. They are, what are the experiences of being a self-identified Black master's level counselor in the predominantly white, non-academic, in particular, mental health setting? What are the challenges and barriers related to race and gender, if any, in particular, with participants? And then how do self-identified Black master's level counselors in predominantly white, non-academic mental health settings respond to, cope with, and overcome these challenges? And so, in other words, not only was I interested in the experiences of participants, I was also interested in how those experiences related to the structures of our professional counseling space. And that is something that carried me throughout my research, is trying to balance understanding the lived experiences while also thinking about how that related to the context in which we do this work. So before the lovely special edition of the listening guide came out, I think it was in June, maybe, there wasn't a lot of how-tos on how to go about putting into practice the listening guide. And so the 3 hours here are the quote unquote original, I suppose, iterative steps of listening guide. And then I've added a couple of steps that are a kind of methodological integration from critical qualitative research methods from Parspecken. And first, there are as a meaning analysis. This is a way of trying to make low-level inferences about what's happening, in the plot in the first listening. And when listening for contrapuntal voices, I used validity claim analyses to try and make sense of not just what is said in the foreground, but what might be happening in the background to understand the possible meanings that were being expressed in the narrative generated by participants. Very briefly, I interviewed 9 folks, 5 of whom identified as women, 4 of whom identified as men, 6 of whom had training as mental health counselors, 3 of whom had training as clinical social workers, and folks were from around the globe. Now, there's no really good way to, in the time that we have together, to do justice to talking about both the voices and also themes, and to kind of present in a way that makes good sense. So what I decided on was to name the 3 overarching emergent themes, and then to select an I poem that I felt was reflective of that theme, and then within those I poems to highlight some of the voices as I understood them. And so this first one is from Tully. Tully, at the time of our work together, was a 62-year-old self-identified Afro-Caribbean cisgender man. He had a booming presence. He wasn't quite my height, so I'm 6'7", by the way. He wasn't quite my height, but he wasn't much shorter than me. So much about him was marked by how much space he took up. And so this I poem, I believe, is marked by the interplay of a number of voices: a voice of vigilance, a voice of understanding, and a voice of learning. And together, for me, they highlight his yearning for connection and how complex it is. It's a struggle against being objectified, as he also struggles to resist objectifying his colleagues. So I'll read it for you. I know how I look and how society programs white women. I have to be careful. I say to myself, okay, don't talk about too much. If you compliment her, make sure it's clear that it's about her ideas. Don't stare. Smile, but just so. You don't want to make her think you're flirting with her. I love people. I'm warm naturally. I wonder, am I really that bad? Would it be that bad to get to know me? I know that women have good reasons to be vigilant. I'm fortunate. I don't blame them. I feel the loneliest at work when all of the clinicians are there. And so this connects to this broader, I think this was a good example of a broader theme of visibility, and how in some ways, participants like Tully struggled with being hyper visible, that they were very much seen, and how they were seen and perceived by their peers affected not only how they experience relationship with their peers, but also how they saw themselves. And then in addition, sometimes simultaneously, but often rhythmically, there is this invisibility where participants struggled with not being seen for how they truly were. Next, I have Warren, and a sample I poem from Warren. Warren was at the time of our work together, a 28-year-old Kenyan cisgender man who had an infectious smile and a very inviting demeanor. For me, so for context, actually, this sample followed a period of time where Warren was expressing some caution, which I understood to be a voice of self-affirmation, where he affirmed his own goodness as he was rebutting the way that white supremacy attempted to deny it. And the I poem here for me highlights how he intentionally sought to affirm his own goodness despite his ambivalence. And so I hear these voices of both knowing and not knowing. And so here, Warren. I know who I am. I know I'm more than the stereotype. I know that. I don't know what I'm trying to say with that. I know that I'm more than a stereotype. I know that I'm not a scary person. I know I'm not hurtful. I know I'm good. You know, I don't know. I feel like white women are scary, man. For me, the oscillation, the knowing and the not knowing, this knowing who he himself is, and then also how he is being perceived, was an example of this idea called dueling consciousness, which is a play on the Du Boisian concept of double consciousness. So dueling consciousness is a concept, as best I can tell, it was created by Ibram Kendi. And for me, it represents how there is this movement, this rhythm, this oscillation between an anti-racist way of self-definition, and then also an assimilationist way of comparing oneself to the standard of white supremacy. And so the movement here, I thought, was a good example. And then for the third selected I poem, we have Sarah. Sarah, at the time of our work together, was a 36-year-old cisgender woman from Nigeria. And for me, this highlights her voices of both knowing and self-determination, not just one after the other rhythmically, but also at times together. And so here's Sarah's words. I realized I have to say it. If I didn't say anything, I would always be put in that role. I don't feel like a Black or African-American expert. I want to stay within my scope. I actually want to learn too. If I just said, I don't know that, I don't want that kind of attention. When I say it, I'm kind of putting it back on them. I try to, make light of it a little. I want them to invest in it. And so for me, this was an example of role encapsulation, which was a theme that was only experienced by the participants who identified as women. This referred to the experience of having their roles at work being limited by the being limited by the ideas and the expectations of their peers and also supervisors. And so for Sarah, she was wrestling with what it was like to be cast into this role against her will of being an expert on all things Black, right? And so as for a lot of reasons that didn't work for her, and she wrestled with how to navigate pushing against those racist expectations, which I won't spend much time on before I pass the baton. But part of what the listening guide helped me to do was, in listening to people's voices, listening to the emergent themes that were constructed by, made up of these voices, I realized that across the board, my participants really struggled with yearning deeply for connection in the workplace with their peers, with their supervisors, and also wanting to resist racist, sexist expectations of them. And so I won't walk through the model that's in front of you, but in a nutshell, it is a three-phase approach where participants were met oftentimes with a kind of microaggression, a racist, sexist microaggression, and they had to figure out what to do. Because on the one hand, if they didn't do anything, they risked reinforcing the racist, sexist expectation, but also by actively challenging them too, they had to deal with the relational consequences of shaking white fragility in the workplace. And this is something that I don't know that I would have heard explicitly without having used the listening guide. And so from there, I will pause and stop sharing and pass the baton to Dr. Kimberly Cherry.
Oh, let me share my screen here. Okay. Can you all see me and hear me? Okay, great. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Okay, great. So welcome. Thank you all for coming today. It's nice to see some familiar faces and screen names on the gallery. My research is, I'll be talking about the listening guide in relation to my research, which is entitled Centering the Voices of Transgender Supervisees Through Critical Inquiry. And I hope that anytime I present my research, I hope that you tend to what's evoked in you as you listen to the stories and findings, and also you know, given this specific focus on the listening guide, how you might utilize this in your own work. So I want to start with my research question. What are the experiences and insights of transgender therapists in clinical supervision? And this question is meant to, has the assumption in it of dominant discourse being, and structures within our field being binary, pathologizing, and erasing. One example in research that I found was that transgender was often, the client was often assumed to be transgender, and the research and therapist was assumed to be cisgender, and those became kind of binary, mutually exclusive categories. And so my question was to disrupt that discourse and promote well-being and justice and liberatory practices in clinical supervision by utilizing the expertise and lived experience of trans professionals within our field. So the framing of my project, beginning with me, my own lens, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, which means I am relationally and systemically trained. I'm primarily a trauma therapist and see mostly queer and trans folks. I've been a supervisee myself. I'm a supervisor. I'm white, queer, I'm a woman with a complex relationship with gender. I'm currently able-bodied, educated, middle-class American citizen, and these things create the lens by which I come to this question, even formed the question in this area of focus, and also the frame, the lens that I use during my analysis and discussion. In my epistemological framework, critical feminism, queer theory, liberation psychology, and these all have in common goals of liberation, social change, transformation, looking at power and social inequities. And here's just a brief description of my methodology. I used narrative inquiry, snowball sampling. I interviewed 8 participants for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and engaged them in a process of member checking after I sent a summary of my analysis. And just to ground again in the listening guide, I know Sue's been over this and Brandon touched on it again, but these 3 sequential listenings, really the first listening began in my interview process, right? I'm listening already for the landscape and the narrative and themes. And of course I did this through the analysis process. The second listening, I poems, and third, contrapuntal voices. And this method of analysis really was provided a strength to me in being able to hold the tensions and complexities and resist binary categories, which is really important in terms of, you know, resisting the gender binary, but many binaries, you know, that's one of the things queer theory talks about and emphasizes, is that binary thinking and binary categories can be oppressive and reductionistic. And this method also allowed me to hold these complexities within individual perspectives as well as across participant stories, and connecting these themes and voices to systems and structures that participants found themselves in. Now, on the other side of the coin, one of the challenges is in holding tensions and complexity. So that's tricky to do. It's really important and valuable, and also challenging. So, and another thing that Sue had mentioned, and I think Brandon too, is that after analysis, now what? Now, how do I think about my findings, and how do I discuss these? And again, there's always complexity there. There's also room for creativity, which I found really fun to use that part of me in this process. So I presented my findings in 3 different categories. And the first, I started with the individual narratives. I really gave attention to each participant and looked at the landscape of their narrative, the themes that emerged, the voices that I heard, the shifts and changes. I constructed I poems from particularly evocative pieces, and found this a really moving way to present each participant's story. And so here we have Henry, who's talking about their experiences in supervision, and you see the shift of the I voice as their experience of themselves changes over time. I had so much exposure. That wasn't part of my experience. I think about where I am now. It was enough for me. No, actually, I expect more of you. I need you to be doing. I need you to be showing. I need you to da 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 da. I have different expectations now, I guess is what I'm saying. I felt like the bar was really low. I had only known negative responses. And so you see there the shifting expectations as Henry learns more about themselves throughout their experiences in training. So the next piece of the findings section was really in creating these are not binary categories. These are work in synchronicity with one another, and sometimes are coexisting, this affirming kind of side and cisgenderist experiences. But I have here a focus on the supervision relationship, but also wanting to see these participants' experiences within their context, their work and learning context. So, you know, the support of coworkers or cisgenderist practices and policies, and then looking at personal impact. And again, these were not binary, but really coexisted and interacted with one another. And so this is where really the listening guide was really helpful in, you know, I kind of teased them out, but saw them in relationship to one another. And again, was able to connect these to how hegemonic structures kind of infiltrate all of these levels of experience. And then the third category of or section of the findings was resilience and resistance. And I think you know, this definitely showed up in the narratives and in the data. And it is also including it is a choice of resistance as well. It disrupts like normative narratives and research about trans people, focusing on oppression and marginalization. And so I really saw here the complexities of navigating cisgenderism and affirming experiences as they even coexisted. So you can see here in this list, there are things like connecting outside of supervision, or even just having to disconnect from a supervisor, but also engaging with a supervisor and making that connection. Protecting the self, but also self-advocating. And so these nuances were really important to include. And then I got to the discussion. This became even a little more tricky as I heard the voices, the silences, the contrapuntal, the multi-vocality of these voices, and to decide what to do with them. But I started with kind of an idea of just voice and silence, and connecting this with Freire's idea of the concept of culture of silence, in which larger structures of that are oppressive and erasing are internalized by individuals, and there literally can be silence around an experience that one is having. I looked at literal voice and metaphorical voice, the stops and starts within the dialogue, eliminated words or phrases, as well as just concepts that may have been silent. For example, many of the participants all of the participants talked about the impact of being misgendered, but none of the participants talked about the experience of being correctly gendered. And it was almost, I interpreted this almost as a, like, this is baseline, just to call me by my name, right? Like we don't even need to mention it, which I thought was interesting. But I used the complexity of these voices and the multivocality of these voices to look at larger themes of power, identity, and relationship. And then at the end, which I'll touch on, the clinical implications for supervisors. So first, the voice of resistance and the voice of self-preservation. And I connected this to dominant culture, the gender binary, and how these voices were in harmony and crossed one another and in dissonance at times. Here I use, my window's in the way of my iPhone here. Here I use the example of Sam, who's quoted saying, "Am I going to lose all credibility if I turn into the angry trans person?" And so here kind of grappling with resistance and also self-preservation, as if the oppressive structures cause that kind of ultimatum. And here he is talking about having a meeting with a boss who's coming to his office to talk to him about something, and it ends up being about a very gendered dress code. He says, I remember, I was like, oh God, I'm being fired. I knew, I was like, what am I going to do? I was like, I don't even know. I kind of laughed. I'll just have to, I want to do a lot of change work. I want to change some of the way people think. Just think of it as a boa. And of course, this was a reference to having to wear a necktie. And so you see the resilience and also the importance of resistance in Sam's voice. And connecting this to larger power structures of settler colonialism. There's a book on gender trauma by Ian Tafi that talks about the pervasiveness of the gender binary being a legacy of settler colonialism and historical trauma. And this relates to identity. Because how participants understand identity are within these contexts where power structures exist. And here I use Henry's example. They're quoted saying, parts are good at keeping stuff out of your awareness that they don't really think is an option. And a theorist that I used called Binohan says that transgender is actually an imperialist translation of a great varieties of gender. So describing how colonization has stripped people and cultures of concepts and language about their own experience of gender and the diversity of gender experience. And so I heard the voice of knowing and not knowing oneself and not knowing oneself. And here Henry in this I poem is confronted with a question by a colleague about their identity. And they say, I was like, what? No one's ever asked me. I don't know. I'm not a man, not a woman. I'm somewhere. I don't know, in my face. I actually started. And continues to describe their own gender journey. And lastly, last category is relationship. I heard the voice of connection and disconnection, Morgan being one example of that. And the listening guide really helped me to capture this voice and what happened in relationship when both cisgenderism and affirmation were co-occurring. So Morgan says, I just felt like I could be myself. And this I poem kind of talks about the varied experiences of supervisors. I felt like with some supervisors, I had to sort of split myself. I think that's probably, I don't know. I think that I wasn't always I didn't want to sacrifice. I really needed. I was sort of finding I could get that. I was dealing with that. I didn't allow myself to feel. I think that I could be my full self. I just didn't feel that. I felt much more. I also offered as a strength. I had to separate it out. And so taking these concepts of power, identity, and relationship, I came up with direct implications for supervisors conceptualized in this critical relational capacity. So things like growing in knowledge of gender and sexuality that's rooted in oppression and healing, being able to name colonization, white supremacy, and cis heteropatriarchy and how these show up in our work. And I love this quote from Ian Tafi that says, healing from gendered trauma lives in the spaces between us, the spaces across which we try to reach for one another when we dream of community. And I think of this relational aspect of our work in supervision as being a potential opportunity for this kind of healing and liberation. And so lastly, I have put my own reflections and I poem from my own researcher reflections in dialogue with a participant, Sky. And one of the challenges is of using the listening guide and tending to voice and a critical inquiry is the continual reflection, the growth, and the emotionality of both grief and inspiration And again, the other side of that coin is a liberation journey and a path to my own self-discovery. I understand, I have loved, I have held, I have a flexible, I relate to clients, I supervise therapists, I have long held, I realized I had much more capacity, I have found. And then Sky's own response to being asked about their reflections as a participant in this research. This is a labor of love. I want this research to be done for people who have been through trauma, which I would consider my first year placement of trauma. People who have been through trauma, like, secretly have a secret longing that it wasn't all for nothing. And like, their story, their pain can be transformed into something. So I mean, that was definitely on my mind for this. And I will leave it with Sky's words. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kimberly and Brandon and Sue, for those amazing, insightful presentations. And it's so poignant, the words of the participants in your two studies, Kimberly and Brandon, and just really appreciate you sharing those words and the research that you've done and kind of bringing that to light and bringing that here to this group for us to get to have a discussion about it. It's really quite powerful, the work you both have done. So I'm so appreciative of it. So I'm Renee Spencer. I'm a professor at Boston University and have the great privilege of just making a few comments. And I'm not going to take much time because I really want people to be able to have conversation and ask questions and talk with our three presenters here. So I'm just going to have just take a couple minutes and offer some reflections on these presentations and on the listening guide. And I want to start by highlighting, well, first I want to say I really feel like the listening guide, as much as it was new and exciting to me when I first entered graduate school, it feels very fresh, new, and exciting to me still now. In many ways, feels like a method for our time. It just feels very timely. I think seeing these two examples here today really exemplify that, and the examples in the qualitative psychology special issue, which if you all haven't had a chance to take a look, I highly recommend it, to take a look at those articles in there and just seeing the power of what can be learned and unearthed and brought to light through this method. I just think it's really powerful. And in the spirit of relationship, because that's really one of the main tenets of this approach, is really taking relationship quite seriously. And so I'm just going to say a little bit about my relationship to this method, which is I had the good fortune of, in graduate school, being surrounded by people who were teaching and implementing this method, the people who created this method, and it was tremendously exciting to be in that environment. So it was really, I was fortunate to show up in my graduate program when I did and have the great colleague in Sue Matulski and Lynn Sorcelli. It was fantastic to be in graduate school with them. And at the same time, I was being trained by one of the giants, Deb Tolman, who's also on this webinar, who was a part of the development of the listening guide and very much in the early days. And her research was really cutting edge in the implementation of the listening guide. So I had that great fortune of being in that environment and around all that excitement. And I'm feeling some of that excitement today in these new early career folks who are implementing this method and taking it up. It's just really great to see this happening. I think also in the spirit of being relational, I think what's really powerful and important is really exemplified in our in Brandon and Kimberly's work is being relational is not just about the questions that are being asked. That's a really important part of it, that it's a real question, as Carol Gilligan would say. It's a question you don't know the answer to. So it's a genuine question that you're trying to, you're on a journey to try to discover, but that question is rooted in you. There's some connection to you and who you are, that's the question that you're pursuing. And the question is rooted in other people, so it goes beyond you. So you need other people to help you answer this question, and it touches other people's lives, and then it extends out to a larger field at the same time. So it kind of has these three very strong roots. And that relational nature of it, of not just the question that's being asked, but who is doing the asking, I also think is really rich in the examples that we have here today in Brandon and Kimberly's work. I think the questions that the two of you asked were profound, and the fact that you were asking those questions and you were the one who was conducting those interviews led to the kinds of narratives that you were able to then work with in your analysis. And I think each of you, along with Sue, made the point that it's not, the listening guide is just not an approach to analysis, it's the whole way through. It's sort of a start to finish approach. And it's going into the data collection activities, if those are interviews, with the kind of true question, open heart, open mind, to engage in the kind of interviews that yielded the narratives that you all had to work with. And I think one of the things that's really important is who each of you are, Brandon and Kimberly, in relationship to the question. So as you were sharing the quotes that you were sharing, I was thinking how important it was who you were, your experiences in evoking what you were able to get your participants to talk about. It was really evident to me that people, there was an authenticity and a vulnerability in what people shared with you, and that who you are mattered in that exchange and in that interview process. So it started back there with the interview. And then when you get to the analysis, now you've got those narratives that you can work with, and you're bringing yourself into that process. Each of you did in that approach. So it is a relational process, and who the researcher is, who's doing the asking of the question, who's doing the listening, who's being listened to, and in what ways. Sort of, Carol Gilligan also talks a lot about resonance. So what's the resonance in the interview? So if I'm offering up an experience, am I going to offer it up to somebody who can hear my experience and all of its fullness and richness and complexity of what I have to say? So again, great, I think, examples of that. I also think these were great examples of really deeply listening, which is what the listening guide is all about. I think in that article on the special issue, Gilligan and Eddie talk about it as radical listening. So it's one aspect of it is allowing yourself to be open to surprises. So that's that real question, and being open and not knowing it all going in, but really trying to discover and learn and be with people and learn, have people join you in trying to answer your question. So that's a piece of it. But another really important piece of it that you all talked about today was the going person by person through the analysis process. So it's not jumping to these cross-cutting themes or what can we learn across all of my participants, but really going person by person and really trying to get a sense of their experiences and deeply learning from that, and then putting those experiences in relationship to one another. And I think the listening guide, it's not the only method that does that, but I think it does an especially good job of that, of really by the steps, by the nature of the process, really forces you to stay in that process sort of person by person, and not sort of, scooch on to the next person too quickly, but really have to deal with the complexity. And I also think it's really a hallmark of the method is to get to that, which our presenters got to today, is sort of the multi-layered nature of people's experiences. It's not this or that, or even this, and this, but it's layered. You can be experiencing multiple things at the same time. They might seem contradictory. They might be working together. They might be working together at some points and contradictory at others. But that kind of holding that complexity is what's really important in this approach. And I think takes us to really important new insights and ways of understanding people's experiences. So calling out that layered aspect of human experience is I think, so important. I got lots more I can say, but I think I'm going to stop because I really would love to open it up and have people have a chance to ask questions and engage in the dialogue. I just want to say thanks to Kimberly and to Brandon and to Sue for these terrific presentations, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I echo the gratitude. I'm kind of the poems are still living in me right now. So let's open it up to conversation, to questions. feel free to either type in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask. I was looking for a hand raising function, but I don't see it. If you can see it on your end and you want to raise your hand, that would make it more systematic for unmuting. But if not, just go ahead yourself. Yeah. Welcoming questions now. Or comments as well, of course. Okay, we have one question. How do you understand the listening guide as different from other narrative inquiry approaches?
Well, I guess I could start with that, but I would welcome other people's responses as well. I think that it does, and well, I guess I should say can connect to other narrative inquiry approaches. I do think it's very narrative in nature. And so listening to people's stories, being in relationship with people, being able to hear people, you know, all of those things are hallmarks of narrative inquiry. I guess what I would say is that the listening guide takes it a step further, or a step in a particular direction, through the I poems and the contrapuntal voices. The first listening for plot, I think, is very similar to most narrative inquiry and some other qualitative approaches as well. But it's really the I poems and the contrapuntal voices that take it a little bit further. And I think in many ways, this is where you're able to get a better sense of things like the associative logic, the sense of what might be happening simultaneously, sort of consciously and subconsciously. So these things of knowing and not knowing, things like that, that's very hard to tease out by just listening and looking at a story. And so I think these other steps really allow for that deeper analysis, that multi-layered analysis. So that would be my response. I'm love to see if anybody else on the panel would like to also respond.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, I think, you know, I think I see the listening guide as a form of a narrative approach. It's in that family of approaches, and I think that it's not like you can draw a really clean, clear line sometimes between these approaches. But I will say, in kind of playing off of what Sue was saying, that rather than themes and stories, which are so prominent in narrative analysis, like it's a difference in way of viewing and thinking. Kind of what are the tools that you're using to think and engage with your data. And I think in narrative approaches, it's often around stories and how stories are constructed and stories are told. And that's an element to the narrative, to the listening guide for sure. But I think it also just really centers the person and the process and the interaction between stories, if you will. So, and stories being one aspect of the person's experience, but they're also talking about feelings, they're talking about their internal world, they're talking about their relationship to the external world. And in the listening guide, you can kind of track some of those things. So it's a way of engaging with the data that I think offers some windows into some other aspects of psychological processes that can be accessed through looking at stories too, for sure. But I think the listening guide opens that up a little bit and provides a little room to think about some of those processes and the interplay with the interpersonal relationships, both between the participant and the researcher, between the participant and the people they're talking about, and the participant and the social context within which the person is embedded, and sort of looking at all of those interrelationships and how that's shaping how the person's experiencing themselves and expressing themselves, and where they can and can't experience and express different parts of themselves. So I think it just helps you tap into different kinds of aspects of the human experience. Not that you can't do that through stories, right? I don't want to create this kind of either or notion, but I think it just facilitates a kind of listening that takes you to somewhat different places.
I don't have a whole lot to add to what you've already said, but I'm thinking of also the evocative nature of presenting an I poem to a reader and giving the audience or the reader access to this voice and the way it's presented in this way. And I'm thinking of every time I hear Brandon's poems, you know, I feel my own contrapuntal voices in my body, you know, of like this empathy and grief around white supremacy, and also a challenge like of, oof, I'm a white woman, and then I have to hold that. And I think that's there's transformative potential in that way of presenting. It's just a way to do it.
I have nothing more to add to what's already been said.
So we have another question. Do you believe this method can be combined with constructive grounded theory?
Well, again, I'll jump in, but it's an interesting question, actually. Thank you, Georgia, for asking it, because I do think that many qualitative methods can be used with other methods. Like, I don't think that we need to get too hung up on disciplinary territory. Like, okay, you can only do this, you can't really do that. I think that there's a lot of ways that things can be combined. And as I said, that first listening is very similar to a number of other qualitative approaches, including grounded theory. I think where it becomes more difficult, which would be more kind of how you used it, you know, and I don't know if there was something particular in your head, but the problem is when I talked about the difference between categorical and contextualizing analysis. So the listening guide and most narrative inquiry looks at context. It doesn't break things up into tiny little snippets. It really looks at what is the person saying in the context of who they are and their relationship and their social and cultural contexts. Grounded theory is really looking at that more categorical coding of concepts and issues, and then building them up, right, into layers to have themes. And so there's lots of things that are similar, but I think that depending on how you would do it, you would sort of have to resolve this idea of including those kinds of findings and including this. So I'm not sure they can be done kind of together as one thing, but I certainly think you could do parts of one and parts of another and then say, okay, here's how I got to the whole by looking at this. I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
I'm ambivalent about it, which is part of it. So I'm super jazzed by the creativity of folks who are coming along and doing all kinds of things with methods, and I find that very exciting. And at the same time, there are times when I think, I'm not so sure. So there are really different headspaces, I think, constructivist grounded theory and listening guide. It's not that they're living on different planets, but they're, as I think as Sue was saying, they're different headspaces in terms of how much context is at the center and kept at the center through a listening guide, throughout the whole listening guide analysis process and interplay between the researcher and the person, and you know, and all of that. That in grounded theory, your headspace is a little bit different headspace, and I'm just not sure what the value added to a constructivist grounded theory study with some of the listening guide might be, or some of constructivist grounded theory with some of the list. You know, I feel like you're sort of in some ways not leaning into the power of each of those methods, because I think there's a really good place and time for constructivist grounded theory approaches where they make a lot of sense and are incredibly valuable. But I would worry, I would think, I don't, you know, I'm always loath to say you can't do it, because then somebody will do a super interesting study, right, and show, oh yeah, look at this great way. But it just, I do think there are different kinds of headspaces, and it would be really important to think about why you're doing that. Why are you combining those pieces? What's the value added? And what's the intention behind that? Because it would also be super labor intensive to combine them and then be true to each of those two methods, which are both pretty intensive approaches.
So please feel free to continue. We have about 10 minutes left, either typing a question in the chat or as Deb had mentioned, you can find the raise hand function in the reactions and raise your hand to just ask a question out loud.
I want to ask one that was put in the chat earlier. I don't know if that person is still here, but somebody asked, if I can find it, what is the role of the participants in the process of analysis, and are the findings shared with them? And I thought that was an interesting question. So what I will say is that that is up to the individual researcher. Like, there is nothing in the listening guide method that says you must do member checking or you should not do member checking. So for example, Kimberly went through a member checking process of sharing her interpretations with her participants and had some actually very interesting things come about this. But other people do not do that. And so on one hand, I think that is an individual decision. But on the other hand, I will also say that I have just written an article on member checking, which will be coming out in Qualitative Psychology in a few months. And so I've just been delving deeply into this issue and find that too many times people just think this is something they ought to do. And that is kind of just knee-jerk a good thing, and it makes for better research. And like most things in qualitative research, you do have to think about, why are you doing this? What is the point? What are the benefits? What are the disadvantages? Because there are some real disadvantages to doing this, and how you do it is really important. And one of the things, particularly with the listening guide, I don't want to get too deep into it because I want to make sure other people have questions. We want to make sure everybody has a voice to ask other questions. But I will just say, remember, we've talked a lot with the listening guide about looking at what is known and not known, looking at what is said and unsaid. And so looking at maybe processes of dissociation where people hold separate things they know, but they don't really know that they know. So if you're asking your participants do they agree with the themes that you've come up with, some of those themes might be things that are somewhat subconscious that they don't know that they know, but you could follow that logic, and your interpretation shows how you have determined that, but they may not see it that way because you're looking at something that's kind of underneath. And there's a whole literature about that. Ruth Ellen Josselson has written a couple of wonderful things about this idea that when you're looking at psychological processes, sometimes you're looking at things that people may not be able to affirm in an interview, whether that's about the process of understanding racism or anti-racism, or the process of understanding trauma. And so I think that complicates the whole idea of member checking around some of the particular topics that the listening guide excels at. And that doesn't mean you can't do it, but it means you have to really think carefully about how you do it and how you are, because they are co-researchers in a way. You are co-constructing the knowledge through that relational connection. But you have to be very careful about how you would go about that. So that's my take. And you can read the article when it comes out if you want to hear more about that. Other comments on that?
I will just say that I invited participants to interact with me about what I had written about them and my thoughts, as following. And one person took me up on it. Everyone else declined. And so I wanted to also add that, practically speaking, it's a big ask. And so I'm aware also that that's something to consider, what more we're asking. anyway, so I decided to invite folks. One person engaged in member checking. That was my experience.
Thank you, Renee, for your comment in the chat. I want to see if we've still got 5 minutes. Let's use it. Does somebody else have a question or a comment? And if you would unmute yourself and just give a comment. I also know that we have Deb Tolman and Chris Head here, who wrote one of the most wonderful articles in the 2021 thing, which gives you a real primer on how to do it. A really nicely laid out example. So if Chris or Deb, you have a comment, or anybody else has a question, please.
I was just going to jump in and say I agree with what Brandon was saying, that I think sometimes we get really caught up about our projects and how important it is to us. And my experience is similar with participants. Many of them, they use the interview and they've moved on in their lives. So I think that's a really good point that you raised, to be sometimes being respectful and reflective for our participants might look really different, you know, than incorporating them in everything. Sometimes it includes giving them their space that they don't want to do anymore. So I think that's a really, I don't think we hear that in articles that people write. I wish that was someplace to write that into an article so that people coming up could see that. I remember learning and reading articles and being surprised by things that weren't, feeling like I had to do things because they weren't in them, in the articles. And so I think that's a really good point. Thanks for raising that.
Thank you, Heather.
Hey, I can add a little bit actually onto the previous two questions. I thought both Sue and Renee did a really good job in their response. And I would just start off with the first question about like, how does listening guide different or similar? When I'm talking to my students, the sort of short version I give them is, are you trying to understand content or process primarily? And process, you know, if you're into process, listening guide's a good way to do that. But there's also, it's the process of engaging with the material, which Renee spoke on a little bit, and Deb's comment actually speaks to this. It's a method by which the analyst kind of systematically engages in a different way. So I'm currently working with a doctoral student, and you know, the sort of the gut reaction is to present findings to your mentor and say, this is what I found. And my response is like, keep going. Like, you've got to keep going with this method if you really want to get the value out of it. It's a systematic tuning into deeper layers and different ways of hearing. So that was my kind of response to the first question. The second question about, can constructivist grounded theory and listening guide be used? I really like Sue's response. Maybe the best question isn't if, but how to do it, and it's really difficult. And I did this sort of out of necessity. I did an initial study that was constructivist grounded theory because I was sort of in exploratory mode. But one of the findings that came out of that study was that the people I was working with, they were telling me they were conflicted. But when you see that in content, in a content level, it doesn't have much power. And so I went and learned how to do the listening guide primarily to go a little deeper with that. Like, okay, you're telling me you're conflicted. Like, how can I show that? How can I accentuate that to the audience? And so that's how I wove those two methods together in two separate analyses, because what was coming out of the first one sort of led me naturally to the second.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's really helpful. And, you know, I know a number of you probably are doctoral students, and you are in that exploratory mode of trying to figure out what's going to work for you, maybe trying one thing or trying another thing. And so it makes sense to, you know, think more about what are you wanting to do and what's worked so far and what have you tried, and then to see if this maybe gives you a different way in. If what we've said today resonates with you and the work that you're doing, then this may provide another way in for you that could be very, very rich. It does take a lot of time, and it's pretty labor intensive. And I think doctoral students really need to know that, because you're on a timeline. So it's important. Brandon's laughing. It's important to look at that as well. Those practical matters, as we were saying.
So we are almost at time. Is there room for any last remark or question? Yes, Deb, I see your hand. Go for it.
Um, Thank you so much for this session. I'm always drawn to presentations on the listening guide because I kind of want to know where it's going and what's happening and what the current issues are. It's always been a very disruptive method. And I think it remains a disruptive method, even as the conventions or kind of issues in qualitative research are present. So I would say some of the as I listen and just as I teach and listen in general, some things that we do, like you were saying, Sue, I really appreciated your comment. Like, why are you doing this? Why is it helpful? And the example of member checking in its usual qualitative methods way, which is usually pretty surface analysis, very good, but surface, can be very distressful, and you could even argue disrespectful. And with remembering the motto, the watchword of the listening guide methods, which is the psyche protects. If we start with the psyche protects, then our question is always, how is that happening in this psychological landscape? What is the psyche doing to protect? What is the psyche protecting from? And then the processes of that lifting of layers from conscious to subconscious to conscious, disrupting, interrupting, being overwhelmed. Those parts of psychological logic are, I think, remain disruptive and radical and frightening to do it, as well as to write about it. And I would also say, so one of the questions I talk a lot with my students about is identifiers. Like, get the list of the ways in which you identify. And I say, so what are you doing with that? Why do I need to know that? How does that affect your analysis? Not just that you are, not that just a statement that it does, but how. Mm-hmm. And that really does require an intensification of, and I like whoever said researcher response. I still say reader response from the old days. But that, I think, forces a kind of deepening and reckoning that can be very useful.
That's great. Thank you, Deb. I think that's a great addition, the psyche protects, and recognizing why that is, as well as, who we are. And again, that how. One of the things I say to students is say, so what? So the question is, okay, I'm this or I'm that, or identify this way. So what? What are the implications there, so that you're always talking about the why, the how in this research? This has been so wonderful. We could talk about this for hours, but I guess we really can't. I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank Brandon and Kimberly for doing such incredible work using the listening guide and sharing it with us. And thank you, Renee, too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Sue, for organizing this. This is incredible. I'm personally inspired. I do liberation psychology and arts-based research. So I'm here thinking that your poems are an incredible gift to your participants beyond the technicalities of member checking. I just think of them as a gift. And so I'm just so proud that SQIP, empowers researchers like all of you in this platform, and will continue to do so through these virtual salons. Please be on the lookout for our next one on December 9th, which will be What's the Difference? A conversation comparing approaches to qualitative research analysis, organized by Ruth Ellen Josselson. So be on the lookout for that. And this will be recorded and shared on our SQIP platform soon. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for this gift. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Andrew.